The room was thick with cigarette smoke and tension. Maps covered every wall, marked with colored pins, arrows, and notations that represented the largest amphibious invasion in human history. Outside, across southern England, over 150,000 men waited in camps and staging areas, loaded onto ships, ready to cross the English Channel and assault the beaches of Normandy. Thousands of aircraft stood ready on airfields. Hundreds of warships lay at anchor in ports and harbors. The entire massive machinery of Operation Overlord was poised to launch, waiting only for the order from one man, General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force. But Eisenhower could not give that order until he received information from another man, one whose name would be largely forgotten by history, despite the critical role he played. That man was Group Captain James Stagg, Chief Meteorological Advisor to Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, and in early June 1944, the fate of the invasion, and possibly the war, rested on his ability to predict the weather. Weather forecasting in 1944 was more art than science, relying on limited data, basic understanding of atmospheric dynamics, and the forecaster's experience and intuition. There were no weather satellites providing real-time images of cloud systems. There were no computer models running thousands of calculations to predict atmospheric behavior. Forecasters relied on surface observations from weather stations, reports from ships at sea, and upper air data from weather balloons. They plotted this information on maps, identified weather systems and fronts, and used their knowledge of how weather systems typically behaved to predict what would happen next. The process was subjective, uncertain, and prone to error, especially when forecasting more than 24 to 48 hours ahead. Yet Eisenhower needed Stagg to forecast conditions in the English Channel 5 to 6 days in advance, because once the invasion fleet sailed, it could not easily be recalled. If the weather turned bad after the fleet was at sea, the invasion would have to proceed under unfavorable conditions or be postponed at enormous cost in security, morale, and logistics. The requirements for invasion weather were demanding and specific. The assault required a low tide at dawn so that obstacles the Germans had placed on the beaches would be visible and could be cleared by engineers. This meant the invasion could only occur on a few days each month when tides were suitable. The next window of favorable tides would begin on June 5th and last only a few days before tides became unsuitable again. If the invasion didn't go on June 5th, 6th, or 7th, it would have to be postponed for at least 2 weeks until the next favorable tide period, and possibly longer if weather remained poor. Postponement would be catastrophic. Over 150,000 men were already briefed on the invasion plans and loaded onto ships. The longer they waited, the greater the chance that German intelligence would learn of the invasion plans through captured personnel, intercepted communications, or simple observation of the massive buildup. Security could not be maintained indefinitely. Morale would suffer as men waited in cramped ships, wondering when they would finally go. The entire alliance's credibility was at stake. Soviet leader Stalin was demanding the Western Allies open a second front in France to relieve pressure on Soviet forces fighting in the East, and further delays would strain the alliance. Beyond tides, the invasion required specific weather conditions. Cloud ceiling needed to be at least 3,000 feet, and visibility at least 3 miles for aircraft to operate effectively. Both transport planes dropping paratroopers inland and bombers attacking German defenses. Wind needed to be below force 4 on the Beaufort scale, roughly 13 to 18 miles per hour, or landing craft would have difficulty reaching the beaches, and amphibious tanks would swamp in rough seas. Ideally, there should be no rain, which would make conditions miserable for troops and reduce visibility. These conditions all needed to coincide: low tide at dawn, adequate cloud ceiling and visibility, acceptable wind speeds, and preferably dry weather. The meteorological requirements were so specific that there were relatively few days in any given year when conditions would be suitable. If weather was poor during the early June-tide window, the invasion might have to wait weeks or even months for another opportunity. Group Captain Stagg was acutely aware of the burden he carried. A Scotsman, 43 years old, he had spent his career in meteorology, serving in the Royal Air Force and working for the British Meteorological Office. He was respected for his knowledge and his careful, methodical approach to forecasting. But he was not naturally suited to the political pressures of his current position. Stagg was a scientist who preferred to deal in probabilities and uncertainties, carefully hedging his forecasts with qualifications and caveats. Now he was required to provide definitive predictions to military commanders who needed clear answers, not scientific equivocation. He had to coordinate between multiple forecasting teams, British and American meteorologists, who often disagreed in their interpretations of weather data and their predictions. He had to present a unified forecast to Eisenhower and the other senior commanders, even when his own team was divided. And he had to do all this knowing that if his forecast was wrong, the invasion could fail, thousands of men could die, and the course of the war could be altered. The pressure was compounded by the personalities involved. Eisenhower was generally calm and thoughtful, willing to listen to expert advice, but he was under enormous pressure himself and needed clear information to make decisions. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill was mercurial and impatient, prone to challenging forecasts and demanding certainty where none existed. American commanders tended to be more optimistic and aggressive, sometimes dismissive of weather concerns. British commanders were more cautious, remembering previous operations that had failed due to poor weather. Stagg had to navigate these personalities, providing information that was scientifically honest while also being useful for decision-making. He could not afford to be so cautious that his forecasts were meaningless, but he also could not be so definitive that he gave false confidence. The balance was extraordinarily difficult to maintain, and as the invasion date approached, the pressure intensified. By late May, the weather situation was becoming clearer, and it was not good. The weather patterns over the North Atlantic and Western Europe were unusually unstable for early June. A series of low-pressure systems were moving across the Atlantic toward the British Isles, bringing clouds, rain, and wind. High-pressure systems that would normally dominate in early June, bringing clear skies and calm conditions, were absent or weak. The long-range outlook suggested that the early June period would see unsettled weather, possibly unsuitable for invasion. Stagg's team began preparing Eisenhower for the possibility that the invasion might have to be postponed. On June 1st, at a commander's meeting, Stagg presented a gloomy forecast. The weather during the June 5th to 7th window would likely be poor, with low clouds, strong winds, and rough seas. The commanders received this news with frustration, but accepted that they might have to delay. The question was whether conditions would improve enough during the tide window to allow the invasion to proceed, or whether they would have to postpone for 2 weeks or more. The meteorological situation was complicated by disagreements within Stagg's team. British forecasters, working at the meteorological office at Dunstable, tended toward one interpretation of the data. American forecasters, working at their own facility at Wide Wing, often reached different conclusions. A third team, based at the Admiralty, sometimes disagreed with both. Stagg had to reconcile these different views and present a single forecast to Eisenhower. The disagreements weren't about basic observations, all the teams had access to the same weather data, but about interpretation and prediction. Weather forecasting required judgment about how weather systems would evolve, and different forecasters, looking at the same data, could reach different conclusions. In early June 1944, as the invasion date approached, these disagreements became more pronounced and more consequential. The fate of the invasion and the lives of hundreds of thousands of men depended on which interpretation was correct. On the morning of June 1st, Eisenhower convened his senior commanders at Southwick House to review the final preparations for Overlord. The room was filled with the men who would execute the invasion: British Admiral Bertram Ramsay, commanding naval forces; British Air Chief Marshal Trafford Leigh-Mallory, commanding air forces; British General Bernard Montgomery, commanding ground forces; American General Omar Bradley, commanding the American First Army; and numerous staff officers and planners. The atmosphere was tense but purposeful. These men had spent months planning every detail of the operation. They knew the beaches, the German defenses, the assault plans, the logistics. They were as ready as they could be. The only remaining variable was weather, and that was beyond their control. All eyes turned to Group Captain Stagg when Eisenhower asked for the meteorological forecast. Stagg stood before the assembled commanders, acutely conscious of the weight of the moment. He explained that weather conditions over the next several days would be dominated by a deep, low-pressure system moving across the Atlantic toward the British Isles. This system would bring strong winds, heavy cloud cover, and rough seas, exactly the conditions the invasion needed to avoid. The forecast for June 5th, the first day of the planned invasion window, was poor. Winds would likely exceed the acceptable limits for landing craft operations. Cloud cover would be extensive, possibly preventing effective air support. Seas would be rough, making the crossing difficult and dangerous for the thousands of small landing craft that would carry troops to the beaches. Stagg's conclusion was clear. If the invasion proceeded on June 5th, as currently scheduled, it would face highly unfavorable weather conditions. The commanders listened in grim silence. This was the news they had feared but half expected, given the unsettled weather patterns of recent days. Eisenhower asked the critical question: would conditions improve during the tide window? If June 5th was unsuitable, what about June 6th or 7th? Stagg hesitated before answering. Forecasting several days ahead was inherently uncertain, and the current weather patterns were particularly difficult to predict. The low-pressure system dominating the forecast was large and slow-moving, and its exact track and speed would determine conditions over the channel. Small variations in the system's movement could mean the difference between acceptable and unacceptable conditions. Stagg explained that there was some possibility of a brief improvement in weather between the passage of the current system and the arrival of the next one, but the timing was uncertain and the improvement might be marginal. He could not give Eisenhower the definitive answer the general needed. The forecast was simply too uncertain. Eisenhower absorbed this information, his face revealing little of what he was thinking. He thanked Stagg and dismissed him, then turned to discuss options with his commanders. The debate among the commanders revealed different attitudes toward risk and uncertainty. Some argued for proceeding on schedule despite the poor forecast. They pointed out that weather forecasts were often wrong, that conditions might not be as bad as predicted, and that the costs of postponement were enormous. Security could not be maintained indefinitely with so many men briefed and loaded onto ships. Morale would suffer from further delays. The political pressure from Washington and London to proceed was intense. Others argued for caution. Montgomery, normally aggressive in his tactical planning, was concerned about the impact of poor weather on the assault. Rough seas would cause seasickness among the troops, reducing their combat effectiveness when they reached the beaches. Low clouds would prevent air support, leaving the assault forces without the bombardment that was supposed to suppress German defenses. Ramsey worried about the naval aspects: landing craft swamping in rough seas, ships unable to provide accurate gunfire support in poor visibility. The entire complex choreography of the naval operation disrupted by weather. Eisenhower listened to all views but reserved his decision. He was the supreme commander, and the final responsibility was his alone. He could not delegate this decision or share the burden. If he ordered the invasion to proceed and weather caused it to fail, the responsibility would be his. If he postponed, and it later emerged that weather had been acceptable after all, the responsibility would still be his. He was caught between the certainty of costs from postponement and the uncertainty of costs from proceeding in poor weather. It was an impossible position, and yet it was precisely the position he had been appointed to occupy. Someone had to make the decision, and that someone was him. He told his commanders they would meet again on June 3rd to review the latest forecasts and make a final decision. In the meantime, preparations would continue as if the invasion would proceed on schedule. The massive machinery of Overlord continued to move forward, but its ultimate fate remained uncertain. Behind the scenes, Stagg and his meteorological team worked frantically to refine their forecasts. They knew the commanders needed better information, more certainty, clearer predictions. But the weather was not cooperating. The low-pressure system approaching from the Atlantic was behaving erratically, not following the patterns that forecasters expected. Different weather stations were reporting conflicting data. Ships at sea were sending observations that didn't fit neatly into the emerging picture. The American forecasters at Wide Wing were interpreting the data differently than the British forecasters at Dunstable, leading to different predictions. The Americans tended to be more optimistic, seeing signs that the weather might improve sooner than the British expected. The British were more pessimistic, emphasizing the strength and persistence of the low-pressure system. Stagg had to somehow reconcile these views and present a unified forecast. The disagreement between British and American forecasters reflected different forecasting philosophies and different experiences. American meteorologists had been trained in a tradition that emphasized synoptic analysis, identifying large-scale weather patterns and predicting their movement. They were confident in their ability to forecast the behavior of major weather systems several days in advance. British meteorologists were more cautious, having learned through experience that North Atlantic weather was notoriously difficult to predict, and that forecasts often went wrong. They preferred to hedge their predictions with qualifications and to avoid overconfidence. These different approaches led to different forecasts from the same data. The Americans saw a weather pattern that would likely shift favorably within a few days. The British saw a pattern that might shift favorably, but might not, and they were reluctant to bet the invasion on that possibility. Stagg, a British meteorologist by training but working in an Allied command structure, had to bridge this gap. On June 3rd, Stagg met with his forecasting teams to prepare for the evening's commanders' meeting. The latest data showed the low-pressure system was indeed moving toward the British Isles and would dominate weather over the Channel on June 5th. All the forecasters agreed on this. The disagreement was about what would happen after that. The American team believed a ridge of high pressure would move in behind the low-pressure system, bringing a brief period of improved weather on June 6th or 7th. The British team was skeptical, arguing that the high-pressure ridge was weak and might not bring sufficient improvement. The Admiralty team sided with the British view. Stagg faced a dilemma. Should he present the optimistic American forecast, the pessimistic British forecast, or try to find some middle ground? He knew Eisenhower needed a clear recommendation, not a recitation of disagreements. But he also knew that presenting a false certainty could be disastrous if the forecast proved wrong. That evening, Stagg stood before Eisenhower and the commanders once again. The room was even more tense than before, because everyone knew this meeting would likely determine whether the invasion proceeded or was postponed. Stagg delivered his forecast. Weather on June 5th would definitely be poor, unsuitable for invasion. Strong winds, low clouds, rough seas, possibly rain. If the invasion proceeded on June 5th, as originally planned, it would face very difficult conditions. There was some possibility, Stagg emphasized the word possibility, that conditions might improve briefly on June 6th, but this was uncertain, and the improvement might not be sufficient. His recommendation, delivered carefully and reluctantly, was that the invasion should be postponed from June 5th. The room erupted in discussion. Some commanders argued for proceeding anyway, accepting the weather risk. Others supported postponement. Eisenhower listened, asked questions, probed Stagg's confidence in the forecast. Finally, he made his decision. The invasion would be postponed 24 hours, from June 5th to June 6th. The fleet, some elements of which had already sailed, would be recalled. They would meet again the next morning to review the latest forecasts and decide whether to proceed on June 6th or postpone further. The postponement from June 5th to June 6th bought Stagg and his team 24 hours, but it also raised the stakes. If weather on June 6th proved unsuitable, the invasion would have to be postponed again, possibly for 2 weeks or more until the next favorable tide period. The window of opportunity was closing rapidly. Eisenhower had made clear that he needed a definitive forecast. He could not keep over 150,000 men loaded on ships indefinitely, waiting for perfect weather that might never come. At some point, he would have to either launch the invasion in less than ideal conditions or postpone it for an extended period, with all the attendant risks to security and morale. Stagg understood that his next forecast would likely be the decisive one. If he predicted acceptable weather for June 6th and was wrong, the invasion could fail. If he predicted poor weather and was wrong, he would have caused an unnecessary postponement, with potentially catastrophic consequences. The margin for error was zero. The weather on June 4th confirmed the wisdom of postponing from June 5th. The storm that Stagg had predicted arrived with full force. Wind howled across southern England, driving rain against windows and whipping the channel into white-capped fury. Ships that had sailed before the postponement order reached them struggled back to port through heavy seas. Soldiers who had been loaded onto landing craft in preparation for departure huddled miserably in the rain, grateful they were not attempting to cross the channel in these conditions. The commanders who had argued for proceeding despite the forecast were silenced by the obvious severity of the weather. Stagg's prediction had been accurate. June 5th would indeed have been disastrous for the invasion. But this validation of his forecasting ability brought no comfort, because the critical question remained unanswered. What would the weather be on June 6th? Would there be a break in the storms, a window of acceptable conditions during which the invasion could proceed? Or would the poor weather persist, forcing a longer postponement? Throughout June 4th, Stagg and his teams analyzed every scrap of weather data they could obtain. Reports came in from weather stations across the British Isles, from ships at sea, from weather balloons launched into the storm. The picture that emerged was complex and contradictory. The low-pressure system that had brought the current storm was indeed moving through as predicted, but its exact speed and track were difficult to determine. Behind it, somewhere over the Atlantic, was the high-pressure ridge that the American forecasters had predicted would bring improved conditions. The critical questions were whether this ridge would arrive in time, whether it would be strong enough to bring acceptable weather, and how long any improvement would last before the next weather system arrived. Different forecasters, looking at the same data, reached different conclusions. The Americans remained optimistic, predicting a definite improvement on June 6th. The British remained cautious, seeing only a possible improvement that might or might not materialize. The disagreement came to a head in a tense meeting of the forecasting teams on the afternoon of June 4th. The American chief forecaster, Colonel Irving Crick, argued forcefully that the high-pressure ridge would definitely bring improved weather on June 6th. He pointed to historical weather patterns, to the current data showing the ridge's movement, to his experience forecasting North Atlantic weather. He was confident, not merely hopeful, but confident, that conditions would be acceptable for invasion. The British chief forecaster, Charles Douglas, was equally forceful in his skepticism. He pointed out that the high-pressure ridge was weak, that its movement was uncertain, that even if it did bring some improvement, the window might be too brief and the conditions too marginal. He argued that betting the invasion on this forecast was too risky. The two men, both experts in their field, both looking at the same data, had reached opposite conclusions. Stagg had to decide which view to present to Eisenhower. Stagg's decision-making process in those critical hours has been the subject of much historical analysis and speculation. He left relatively few records of his exact reasoning, and much of what we know comes from his own post-war accounts and the recollections of others present. What is clear is that Stagg did not simply accept one team's forecast over the other. Instead, he conducted his own analysis, looking at the raw weather data and applying his own judgment and experience. He focused particularly on observations from weather stations in the Atlantic west of Ireland, which would give the earliest indication of whether the high-pressure ridge was indeed moving toward the British Isles as predicted. These stations were reporting rising barometric pressure, which suggested the ridge was approaching. The rate of pressure rise and its geographical extent would indicate the ridge's strength and likely impact on channel weather. Stagg studied these observations carefully, comparing them to historical patterns and to the predictions of his forecasting teams. What Stagg saw in the data was not certainty, but possibility, a narrow window of opportunity that might open on June 6th. The high-pressure ridge was indeed approaching, but it was weak and its influence would be brief. If it arrived on schedule, it would bring a temporary improvement in weather over the channel. Winds decreasing to acceptable levels, clouds lifting somewhat, seas moderating. This improvement would not be ideal conditions. It would be marginal conditions, barely meeting the minimum requirements for invasion. And the window would be brief, perhaps only 36 hours before the next weather system arrived and conditions deteriorated again. But it would be enough, just barely enough, to allow the invasion to proceed. The alternative was to postpone for at least 2 weeks, with all the risks that entailed. Stagg made his decision. He would recommend to Eisenhower that the invasion proceed on June 6th, based on a forecast of marginal but acceptable conditions during a brief weather window. It was in many ways a gamble, a calculated risk based on limited data and uncertain predictions. But it was the best judgment he could make given the information available. At 9:30 on the evening of June 4th, Stagg entered the library at Southwick House, where Eisenhower and his commanders had assembled for what everyone knew would be the critical weather briefing. The room was crowded and tense. Eisenhower sat in a chair near the fireplace, his face drawn with fatigue and stress. Montgomery sat nearby, characteristically confident despite the uncertainty. Ramsey and Lee Mallory stood by the windows, looking out at the rain. Bradley and other American commanders clustered around a map table. Staff officers lined the walls. Everyone fell silent when Stagg entered. He walked to the front of the room, carrying his weather charts and notes. Outside, wind rattled the windows, and rain drummed on the roof, a reminder of the storm that was supposed to determine the invasion's fate. Stagg cleared his throat and began to speak. What he said in the next few minutes would change the course of history. Stagg's forecast was carefully worded, balancing scientific caution with the need to provide clear guidance for decision-making. He explained that the current storm would move through during the night and the following morning. Behind it, a ridge of high pressure was approaching from the Atlantic. This ridge would bring a temporary improvement in weather over the channel, beginning late on June 5th and continuing through June 6th and into June 7th. Winds would decrease to acceptable levels, force 3 to 4, within the operational limits. Cloud cover would break up somewhat, with ceiling rising to 4,000 to 5,000 feet, adequate for air operations. Seas would moderate, though they would still be rougher than ideal. The improvement would not be perfect conditions, but it would be acceptable conditions, sufficient for the invasion to proceed. Critically, Stagg emphasized that this window would be brief. By June 8th, the next weather system would arrive, and conditions would deteriorate again. If the invasion was to proceed during the current tide period, June 6th was the opportunity. After that, conditions would be unsuitable until the next tide period, 2 weeks later. The silence in the room after Stagg finished his briefing was profound. Every man present understood the magnitude of what they had just heard. Stagg was predicting a narrow window of acceptable weather. Not good weather, but acceptable weather, that would open on June 6th and close again within 36 hours. If his forecast was correct, the invasion could proceed. If he was wrong, thousands of men might die in conditions that made success impossible. Eisenhower sat motionless in his chair, his face revealing nothing of his thoughts. He had listened to Stagg's briefing without interruption, occasionally making notes on a pad of paper. Now he looked around the room at his commanders, gauging their reactions. Montgomery caught his eye and gave a slight nod. The British general, usually cautious, seemed willing to proceed. Ramsay looked troubled, but said nothing. Lee Mallory, who had previously expressed strong concerns about weather-affecting air operations, appeared skeptical, but not openly opposed. Eisenhower began to poll his commanders, asking each for their opinion. Should they proceed on June 6th based on Stagg's forecast, or postpone again? The responses revealed the different perspectives and priorities of the various commanders. Ramsay, responsible for naval operations, expressed concern about sea conditions. Even with the predicted moderation, seas would still be rough enough to cause difficulties for landing craft, and to make many soldiers seasick before they reached the beaches. However, he acknowledged that naval forces could operate in the predicted conditions, even if not optimally. Lee Mallory was more pessimistic. He worried that cloud cover, even at 4,000 to 5,000 feet, would prevent effective air support. Without air superiority and close air support, the assault forces would be vulnerable to German counterattacks. He did not explicitly recommend postponement, but his concerns were clear. Montgomery was characteristically direct. He believed they should go. The conditions would not be ideal, but they would be adequate, and further delay posed greater risks than proceeding in marginal weather. The American commanders generally favored proceeding. Bradley argued that the troops were ready, the plans were solid, and acceptable weather was sufficient. They did not need perfect weather. He worried more about the effects of prolonged delay on morale and security than about the risks of marginal weather. Other American officers echoed this view, emphasizing the political and strategic costs of postponement. The British commanders were more divided, reflecting their greater caution and their historical experience with operations that had failed due to poor weather. But even among the British, there was recognition that postponement carried its own risks. The longer they waited, the greater the chance that German intelligence would discover the invasion plans. Already, over 150,000 men knew the details of the operation. Maintaining security with so many people briefed was nearly impossible. Every day of delay increased the likelihood of a security breach that could compromise the entire operation. Eisenhower listened to all the opinions, but said little. He asked Stagg a few questions, probing the meteorologist's confidence in the forecast. How certain was he that the weather window would materialize? What was the risk that conditions would be worse than predicted? Stagg answered honestly, he was reasonably confident in the forecast, but weather prediction was inherently uncertain. There was definitely a risk that conditions would be worse than predicted, but there was also a possibility they would be better. Based on the available data and his professional judgment, he believed the forecast was sound and that conditions on June 6th would be acceptable for invasion. Eisenhower nodded, absorbing this information. He looked around the room one more time, meeting the eyes of his senior commanders. Then he made his decision. They would proceed. The invasion would launch on June 6th. If Stagg's forecast proved correct, they would have their window. If it proved wrong, they would face the consequences. The order was given. Operation Overlord would commence in the early hours of June 6th, 1944. The room erupted in controlled activity as commanders and staff officers moved to implement the decision. Orders had to be transmitted to hundreds of units across southern England. Ships had to be prepared to sail. Aircraft had to be readied for takeoff. Paratroopers had to be briefed and loaded onto transport planes. The entire massive machinery of the invasion had to be set in motion, coordinated across multiple services and two nations. Eisenhower remained in his chair for a moment after the others had left, alone with his thoughts. He had made the decision, but the responsibility weighed heavily on him. In a few hours, men would begin moving toward the beaches of Normandy. Some would not return. If the operation failed, if weather caused disaster, the responsibility would be his. He took out a piece of paper and wrote a brief statement, taking full responsibility in case the invasion failed. He dated it July 5th, a mistake caused by stress and fatigue, and put it in his pocket. Then he rose and went to oversee the final preparations. Stagg left Southwick House and returned to his meteorological office, emotionally and physically exhausted. He had delivered his forecast, Eisenhower had accepted it, and now events would prove whether he had been right. There was nothing more he could do except monitor the weather and hope his prediction was accurate. His team continued to analyze incoming data throughout the night, looking for any sign that the forecast might be wrong, that the weather window might not materialize. The data continued to support the forecast. The storm was moving through, the high-pressure ridge was approaching. Conditions should improve, as predicted. But weather forecasting was not an exact science, and Stagg knew that even small errors in predicting the movement or strength of weather systems could have large consequences. He tried to rest, but could not sleep. Too much was at stake. He paced his office, studying weather charts, rechecking calculations, second-guessing his decision. Had he been too optimistic? Should he have recommended further postponement? Or had he been right to see the narrow window of opportunity and advise Eisenhower to take it? Throughout the night of June 4th and into the early morning of June 5th, the invasion force began to move. Ships slipped their moorings and headed out into the channel, forming into the massive convoys that would carry the assault forces to Normandy. Paratroopers boarded transport aircraft at airfields across southern England, checking their equipment one final time before takeoff. Soldiers on landing craft tried to rest, knowing they faced a rough crossing and a dangerous landing. The weather remained poor. Wind and rain continued, though perhaps with slightly less intensity than earlier in the day. To the men preparing to cross the channel, it seemed impossible that conditions would improve enough by morning to allow the invasion to proceed. Many assumed they would be recalled, that the operation would be postponed again. But the orders did not change. The fleet continued to sail. The aircraft continued to prepare for takeoff. Eisenhower's decision stood. The invasion would proceed, weather permitting, in less than 24 hours. At Southwick House, Eisenhower met with his commanders again at 4 a.m. on June 5th for a final weather update. Stagg reported that conditions were evolving as predicted. The storm was moving through, the high-pressure ridge was approaching, and the weather window should open later that day and continue through June 6th. Winds were already beginning to decrease. Cloud cover should break up during the day. Seas would moderate, though they would remain rougher than ideal. The forecast remained unchanged, marginal but acceptable conditions for invasion. Eisenhower asked if there was any reason to reconsider the decision to proceed. Stagg said no, the forecast was holding, and conditions should be adequate. Eisenhower looked around at his commanders one final time. Anyone who wanted to argue for postponement could speak now. No one spoke. The decision was final. The invasion would proceed. Eisenhower dismissed the meeting with a simple statement that would become famous. "Okay, let's go." With those words, the largest amphibious invasion in history was irrevocably set in motion. In the darkness before dawn on June 6th, the first elements of the invasion force reached the coast of Normandy. Paratroopers from the American 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions and the British 6th Airborne Division had dropped inland during the night, tasked with securing key bridges, road junctions, and other objectives to protect the flanks of the beach landings. The drops had been scattered and chaotic. High winds and clouds had disrupted the carefully planned flight paths, and many paratroopers landed miles from their intended drop zones. But the airborne forces had accomplished their primary missions, and now the seaborne assault was beginning. As the first gray light of dawn appeared on the eastern horizon, thousands of landing craft approached 5 beaches along a 50-mile stretch of the Normandy coast: Utah and Omaha beaches in the American sector, Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches in the British and Canadian sector. The weather was exactly as Stagg had predicted: windy, cloudy, with rough seas, but within acceptable limits for operations. The crossing of the channel had been difficult. Seas were rougher than the troops had experienced in training exercises, and many soldiers were violently seasick during the hours-long voyage from England to France. Landing craft pitched and rolled in the waves, throwing men against each other and against equipment. Some craft took on water and had to be bailed constantly to stay afloat. A few swamped and sank, drowning the men aboard. The amphibious tanks that were supposed to lead the assault at Omaha Beach had particular difficulty. Many sank in the rough seas before reaching shore, their flotation screens inadequate for the conditions. The naval bombardment that preceded the landings was less accurate than planned, because ships had difficulty maintaining stable firing platforms in the rough seas. The air bombardment was also less effective than hoped. Cloud cover forced bombers to delay their bomb release to avoid hitting the landing craft, and most bombs fell inland, missing the German beach defenses entirely. The weather was not preventing the invasion, but it was making everything harder and reducing the effectiveness of the massive firepower that was supposed to suppress German defenses before the infantry landed. At Omaha Beach, the combination of rough seas, ineffective bombardment, and strong German defenses created a crisis. The first waves of American infantry landed in chaos, with landing craft depositing men in the wrong locations, under heavy fire from German positions that had survived the bombardment. The rough seas had swamped most of the amphibious tanks, leaving the infantry without armored support. Men struggled through chest-deep water under machine gun and artillery fire, weighed down by heavy equipment, many drowning before reaching the beach. Those who made it to shore found themselves pinned down by fire from German bunkers and pillboxes that dominated the beach. Bodies floated in the surf. Wounded men cried for help. Landing craft burned. For several hours, the situation at Omaha was desperate, and commanders offshore considered abandoning the beach and diverting follow-on forces to other sectors. But gradually, through individual acts of courage and small unit initiative, American soldiers began to move off the beach, finding gaps in the German defenses, destroying bunkers, pushing inland. By midday, the situation at Omaha had stabilized, though at terrible cost, over 2,000 American casualties on that single beach. The other beaches saw more success. At Utah Beach, the American landing was relatively light opposition, partly because the current had pushed the landing craft 2,000 yards south of the intended beach, to a sector that was less heavily defended. At Gold, Juneau, and Sword Beaches, British and Canadian forces landed against moderate resistance and pushed inland, though progress was slower than planned and none of the D-Day objectives, including the city of Caen, were captured on the first day. The rough seas caused problems at all the beaches, landing craft broaching in the surf, vehicles getting stuck in soft sand, supplies being lost or damaged by water. But the weather did not prevent the landings. Stagg's forecast had been accurate. Conditions were marginal, but acceptable. The invasion proceeded, and by the end of June 6th, over 150,000 Allied troops were ashore in Normandy, holding a tenuous but expanding beachhead. The Atlantic Wall, Hitler's supposedly impregnable coastal defense, had been breached. The liberation of Western Europe had begun. The weather window that Stagg had predicted proved to be exactly as he had described: brief and marginal. Conditions on June 6th were acceptable for operations, though far from ideal. The rough seas and cloud cover caused difficulties and reduced the effectiveness of air and naval support, but they did not prevent the invasion. On June 7th, conditions remained acceptable, allowing the buildup of forces and supplies to continue. But by June 8th, as Stagg had warned, the weather deteriorated again. A new storm moved in, bringing high winds and rough seas that disrupted supply operations and damaged the artificial harbors, called mulberries, that were being constructed to support the invasion. The storm that hit Normandy from June 19th to 22nd was even worse, the worst June storm in the Channel in 40 years, destroying one of the mulberry harbors and setting back the buildup schedule by weeks. If Eisenhower had postponed the invasion from June 6th, this storm would have occurred during the next tide period, making an invasion in mid-June impossible. The next opportunity would not have come until July, by which time German intelligence might well have discovered the invasion plans, and German defenses in Normandy would have been further strengthened. In retrospect, Stagg's forecast and Eisenhower's decision to proceed on June 6th appear to have been exactly right. The weather window that Stagg predicted did materialize, allowing the invasion to succeed. If Eisenhower had postponed, waiting for better weather, he would have missed the only viable opportunity in June and possibly in July as well. The invasion might have been delayed for months, with incalculable consequences for the war. Yet at the time, the decision was far from obvious. Stagg's forecast was based on limited data and uncertain predictions. The weather window was marginal, not ideal. Eisenhower was betting the invasion, and possibly the outcome of the war, on a meteorologist's judgment that conditions would be barely adequate. It was a calculated risk, and it succeeded. But it could easily have failed if the high-pressure ridge had been weaker or slower than predicted, if the weather window had not materialized, if conditions on June 6th had been worse than forecast. The invasion could have ended in disaster. Thousands more men might have died. The beachhead might have been lost, and the course of the war might have been very different. The success of D-Day made heroes of many: the paratroopers who jumped into the darkness, the infantry who stormed the beaches, the sailors who navigated the landing craft through rough seas, the commanders who planned and executed the operation. Eisenhower's leadership and his willingness to make the difficult decision to proceed on June 6th were rightly celebrated. But the role of James Stagg and his meteorological team was less widely recognized. Stagg provided the critical information that made Eisenhower's decision possible. His forecast was accurate, his judgment was sound, and his willingness to recommend proceeding despite the marginal conditions showed both scientific skill and moral courage. If he had been more cautious, if he had emphasized the uncertainties rather than the possibilities, Eisenhower might have postponed, and the opportunity might have been lost. If he had been overconfident, if he had predicted better conditions than actually occurred, the invasion might have failed. Stagg walked a narrow line between excessive caution and excessive confidence, and he got it right. His contribution to the success of D-Day was as important as that of any general or admiral, yet his name is largely forgotten, while theirs are remembered. In the days and weeks following D-Day, as the Allied beachhead in Normandy expanded and the campaign to liberate France gained momentum, the significance of the weather decision became increasingly apparent. The storm that struck Normandy from June 19th to 22nd demonstrated just how narrow the window of opportunity had been. This storm, which lasted 3 days and brought winds exceeding force 6 and seas far too rough for landing operations, would have made an invasion impossible. If Eisenhower had postponed from June 6th to the next favorable tide period around June 19th, the invasion fleet would have been caught at sea or attempting to land in the midst of this storm. The consequences would have been catastrophic: landing craft swamped, ships driven ashore, troops drowned, the entire operation thrown into chaos. Even if the fleet had remained in port waiting for the storm to pass, the delay would have extended into July, with all the attendant risks to security and the possibility of further weather delays. The June 19th storm also revealed the limitations of weather forecasting in 1944. Despite the experience gained from predicting the June 6th weather window, meteorologists did not accurately predict the severity or duration of the later storm. It arrived with less warning than expected and proved more destructive than forecast. This demonstrated that Stagg's successful prediction of the June 6th window had involved not only skill, but also an element of luck. Weather forecasting was improving, but it remained an inexact science, dependent on limited data and imperfect understanding of atmospheric dynamics. The fact that Stagg's forecast for June 6th proved accurate did not mean that all forecasts would be equally successful. The weather had cooperated with the invasion, but it might easily have not done so. Eisenhower's decision to proceed had been vindicated by events, but it had been a gamble, and gambles can fail even when they are well calculated. The success of D-Day had profound consequences for the course of World War II and for subsequent history. The establishment of a second front in Western Europe forced Germany to fight a two-front war, dividing its forces between the Eastern Front against the Soviet Union and the Western Front against the Americans, British, and Canadians. This hastened Germany's defeat and shortened the war in Europe, which ended in May 1945. The successful invasion also determined the post-war political landscape of Europe, because Western Allied forces liberated France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and eventually Western Germany. These countries fell within the Western sphere of influence rather than the Soviet sphere. If D-Day had failed or been significantly delayed, Soviet forces advancing from the east might have liberated more of Europe, extending Soviet control further west and fundamentally altering the post-war balance of power. The decision to proceed on June 6th, based on Stagg's weather forecast, thus had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate military situation. For Eisenhower, the success of D-Day confirmed his reputation as a strategic leader, capable of making difficult decisions under extreme pressure. His willingness to proceed on June 6th, despite the marginal weather forecast, and his willingness to take full responsibility if the operation failed, demonstrated the qualities of leadership that would later make him President of the United States. Yet Eisenhower himself always acknowledged the role that weather and luck had played in the success of the invasion. In his memoirs, he wrote that the decision to proceed on June 6th was the most difficult he had made during the war, and that the success of the operation owed much to the accuracy of Stagg's forecast and to the fortunate timing of the weather window. Eisenhower understood that leadership involves making decisions with incomplete information and uncertain outcomes, and that even the best decisions can fail if circumstances do not cooperate. For James Stagg, D-Day was the defining moment of his career, though he remained characteristically modest about his role. After the war, he returned to civilian meteorology, eventually becoming Director of Services at the British Meteorological Office. He wrote about his experiences forecasting for D-Day, providing valuable historical records of the decision-making process. He emphasized that the forecast had been a team effort involving multiple meteorologists and forecasting centers, and that the success had depended on the cooperation between British and American forecasters, despite their different approaches and predictions. Stagg also acknowledged the uncertainties involved in the forecast and the element of luck in its accuracy. He had made the best prediction possible with the available data and methods, but he recognized that weather forecasting in 1944 was far from perfect, and that the outcome could easily have been different. The D-Day weather decision had lasting impacts on military meteorology and on the relationship between weather forecasting and military operations. The experience demonstrated the critical importance of accurate weather prediction for large-scale military operations, particularly amphibious invasions. It led to increased investment in meteorological services, in weather observation networks, and in research to improve forecasting methods. The cooperation between British and American meteorologists during the D-Day forecast, despite their initial disagreements, became a model for international scientific collaboration. The recognition that weather could determine the success or failure of major operations led to the integration of meteorologists into military planning staffs and to the development of specialized military weather services. Modern military operations routinely incorporate weather forecasting into planning and execution, a practice that owes much to the lessons learned from D-Day. The story of the D-Day weather decision also illustrates broader themes about decision-making under uncertainty, about the relationship between scientific expertise and political or military leadership, and about the role of chance in history. Eisenhower had to make a decision with life and death consequences based on incomplete information and uncertain predictions. He could not wait for perfect information because the opportunity would pass. He had to rely on expert advice from Stagg, but he also had to exercise his own judgment about how much confidence to place in that advice and how much risk to accept. The decision involved not only technical analysis of weather data, but also consideration of strategic factors, political pressures, and human factors like morale and security. It was a decision that no amount of planning or analysis could make easy or certain. Eisenhower made the best decision he could with the information available, and events proved him right. But the outcome could easily have been different, and the decision would then be remembered very differently. The question of what would have happened if Eisenhower had decided differently, if he had postponed from June 6th to a later date, remains one of the great counterfactuals of World War II. If the invasion had been delayed to the next tide period and caught in the June 19th storm, it might have failed catastrophically, possibly setting back Allied plans for months and allowing Germany to strengthen its defenses. If the invasion had been delayed until July and German intelligence had discovered the plans, the element of surprise would have been lost and casualties might have been far higher. If the invasion had succeeded despite a longer delay, the war might have lasted longer, more people might have died, and the post-war political landscape might have been different. And we cannot know what would have happened, but we can recognize that Eisenhower's decision to proceed on June 6th, based on Stagg's forecast of a narrow weather window, was one of the pivotal moments of the 20th century. The decision was made by human beings, a general and a meteorologist, using imperfect information and uncertain predictions, yet it shaped the course of history. In the end, the D-Day weather decision reminds us that history is not predetermined, that outcomes depend on decisions made by individuals in moments of crisis, and that those decisions often involve accepting risk and uncertainty. Eisenhower and Stagg faced an impossible situation. They had to predict the unpredictable, to make a decision that would affect millions of lives based on incomplete knowledge of atmospheric conditions over the North Atlantic. They did the best they could with the tools and information available to them. They made a judgment call. They took a calculated risk, and they succeeded. The invasion proceeded, the weather window materialized, the beaches were stormed, and the liberation of Europe began. It could have gone differently, The weather might not have cooperated, the forecast might have been wrong, the decision might have led to disaster. But it didn't. On June 6, 1944, the weather, the forecast, the decision, and the execution all came together in a moment that changed the world. And at the center of that moment was a meteorologist named James Stagg, whose accurate forecast and sound judgment helped make D-Day possible.